This is John Nichols of The Nation magazine, and you're listening to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.
Stand up, you've been sitting way too long.
Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. My name is Steve Scrovan, along with my trusty co-host, David Feldman. Hello, David.
Hope everybody's going to behave this morning.
Yes, the kids are loose. And our indefatigable producer, did I say that right? Indefatigable.
Nope, you always say it wrong.
Our indefatigable, our tireless, let's just say tireless producer, Hannah Feldman. Hello, Hannah.
Hi, Steve. No one has ever called me tireless. I am medically very tired. So,
all right. Well, we won't get into that. And probably the MVP of the whole show, our engineer, Jimmy Lee Wirt. Hello, Jimmy.
Hi, they let me out of the basement.
Yeah, a little bit. We got a little window open there behind you. Who will not be here in person, although you will be hearing his voice, is the man of the hour, Ralph Nader, because this is a special year in review show that we're doing. Happy New Year to everybody. And we've decided to do this as a staff picks highlight show. So each of us have picked various highlights throughout the year for quotations from various guests that we thought were significant and were indicative of what we do here at the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. So you'll hear Ralph's voice, but we're going to be talking about our picks, talking about why we pick them, and doing a little post-mortem on each quote that we pull up here. And one of the major themes that we probably talked about just in some form or another across every program was the genocide in Gaza. And I dare say we may have been the first ones to actually call it a genocide. I remember Bruce Fein, even before in 2023, soon after October 7th, saying it was probably a genocide before the war, according to Article 2 of the Genocide Convention. But we spent a lot of time on that. We've picked two selects from that. The first one was one that I picked from Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, who joined us twice this year. But the first time, he talked about the accusation that the reason there were so many Palestinian casualties and deaths was because the Hamas, were using their own people as human shields, which always struck me as kind of bogus, especially when Miko Peled from a previous episode had said that, the IDF is centered right in the middle of Tel Aviv. So that means the Israelis are probably using human shields too. But here's the clip of Dr. Feroze Sidhwa, the doctor who actually was there on the ground treating Palestinian casualties, talking about human shields. Roll that, Jimmy.
The use of human shields by Israel, even just in the past year, including children, and not even only in Gaza, especially including, in fact, in particular in the West Bank, is shocking. It's on video. It's oftentimes on Israel's own body cam videos, which for some reason, I don't know how they've actually been released. I'm not sure about that. And beyond that, it's not just sending, say, a Palestinian to go knock on the neighbor's door, the so-called neighbor procedure. The Israeli military is actually dressing up. And again, this is all video documented. There's no question about it whatsoever. The Israeli military is putting Palestinians in Israeli military uniforms and marching them through buildings to see if someone will shoot at them, to see if they'll trigger a booby trap. This is outrageous. It's crazy. I mean, and then on the flip side, when they say Hamas or whoever is using human shields, it's almost laughable, because why would the Palestinians think that the presence of Palestinian civilians will stop the Israeli military from blowing something up? It's just ridiculous. It doesn't stop them anywhere else. They drop these huge bombs on tents. They shoot children in the head constantly. Why would they be hesitant about blowing up this or that civilian?
So not only the accusation that Hamas is using Palestinians as human shields, it's really the Israelis using Palestinians as human shields in Gaza.
there are so many stories we've heard over the course of the year that in your gut, there's evil going on. And then you're like, are you trying to be a supervillain? Like, are you trying? Is this a Bond villain audition? And there's so much that we've heard out of Palestine that is just undeniable. And then you still manage to get that gut punch.
And it's not even, imagine the stories that are going to come out once reporters are actually allowed in there.
I mean, if anyone lived, if they kill everyone,
Well, that's another quote that I was going to pull from Nassim Taleb, where he basically, he analyzes risk and he's very logical. And he says, there's no way they can kill them all. So this is really a lost cause for Israel in so many ways in the long term. And the stories that will come out, imagine, all the stories that came out after the initial horror of the Holocaust during World War II and the stories that continuously come out. It's the tip of the iceberg, and this is just one of those that is horrifying.
We're always reminded of what human beings are capable of when they're put in a situation. The video, I can't watch it, of the prisoner here in the United States, in New York State, being beaten to death. Every human is capable of this when they're put into positions where their animal instincts are celebrated.
Yeah, I think the question is, every human is capable. Like, I would tweak that to, like, if you are made capable. Like, I'm not capable of doing that because I'm not in the IDF. I'm not a prison guard. I do not literally have the capacity to harm people the way the prisoners are harmed or the way Palestinians are being harmed by Israeli military, right? Like, I don't have that literal capacity. The thing that...
But you could find it.
Well, no, I mean, like, I am not empowered. I mean, that's when we talk about what people do with power. To me, that's the fundamental hypocrisy, the original sin of the way Israel has treated Palestinians is to be a people based in diaspora and based in, like, if we trust biblical history, let's just take it as real. Since the fall of the Second Temple, Jews have not had a homeland. There has not been a Jewish state. And we have been, I identify as Jewish, so I will say we have been guests in countries run by other cultures and known what it's like to be a minority, to live at the pleasure of a hegemony. And for a modern state with all of the resources and knowledge that we've had since the state was founded, for a modern state built on the premise of we've been disenfranchised and we've been a diaspora, to take this approach. What do we do when we get power? We don't learn lessons from our own negative experiences. We hurt other people. Like, that to me is the original sin of it, is when you are given the chance to either show people how it's done or do harm, to do harm like this and so unapologetically, it's unconscionable. And it's embarrassing, like, not to minimize it, but like, I wouldn't do that if I were put in that position.
It's like why people like Norman Finkelstein are so rare, whose parents suffered through the Warsaw Ghetto and were witness to that, were part of that, and refused to repeat that original sin. Let's move on to the next clip. Hannah, you picked a clip that was on the subject of Gaza. Tell us about why you picked this and who it is.
I picked a clip from when we had Craig Mokhiber on, when the episode's called Israel's Wall of Impunity. And
Craig Mokhiber was the UN official who resigned shortly after October 7th, a protest of the UN's lack of action on what was going on there.
Yes. And the clip I picked is your question, Steve, about after the ICC issued arrest warrants for Benjamin Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, and you asked whether it would actually, like, whether they'd actually be arrested or whether it was just symbolic. And after we play the clip, I'll speak more about why I chose it. I don't want to spoil it. So,
all right,
Jimmy, roll the clip, please.
I wanted to get back to the International Criminal Court. And what is the likelihood that Netanyahu and his minions will actually be arrested, or is this largely symbolic?
It is at the moment unlikely that they will be arrested, but it's not symbolic. And the reason is because it has already had an impact on Netanyahu and Gallant's lives. They cannot travel to at least 124 countries with confidence. They cannot pursue their personal interest or their governmental interest or otherwise, because those states are obliged to arrest them and to hand them over to the court. Now, it's true that the U.S. has been working behind the scenes to peel off some of those Western states that have subsequently, France and others, issued equivocal statements on whether or not they would meet their obligations under the Rome Statute to arrest Netanyahu. But in the end, I believe that the statute will prevail. And that means not only in those 124 countries, but in other countries as well, where states have obligations under other treaties, not least the Genocide Convention, who are bound by the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice, they too may feel compelled to cooperate with the court. So it is unlikely that Israel will hand over its perpetrators for international trial, but they are already extremely limited. They have been marked as fugitives from justice, as suspected perpetrators of crimes against humanity. That impact is real, and it is a part of chipping away at that longstanding impunity of Israel, and therefore it's extremely important. So they may never be brought to trial, but they will pay a cost for these enormous crimes.
Yeah. So the reason I picked that, and the reason that clip stuck with me, is there are huge issues that seem insurmountable, and the pursuit of justice for this genocide it's a big project. There are a lot of people who are doing harm, but I think his point that it is both symbolic and materially going to change things. Like, it might not mean that Netanyahu and Gallant go to prison, but they're fugitives in a lot of countries, and something that we might look at it from afar and go, it's not enough. It's something.
It also is that question of, do you do the right thing for its own sake, or do you do the right thing because you will get a particular result? And there's an argument to be made here, which Craig Mokhiber is making, that even if you do not get the results you want, you need to make the statement that articulates the moral principle.
It does have an impact. From what I've read, there was a ceremony to commemorate Auschwitz, and Netanyahu begged out. He wouldn't travel to Poland for fear of being arrested after the ICC issued these arrest warrants.
Great. Another big point of coverage on the show this year was obviously the presidential election, and we had some interesting takes on that. The first one is my selection when we spoke not that long ago to Ryan Grimm from Dropsite News, and Ralph had an interesting question to ask him. Jimmy?
Well, you know as well as anybody, Ryan Grimm, that he is a lawless politician. He has said with Article 2, I can do whatever I want as president. That was in July 2019. Now he's bolstered by the Supreme Court decision and his clear victory in the Electoral College and in the popular vote. So what do you see as restraints? Who's going to restrain this man?
Well, time is one of his restraints, and incompetence is another. He's up against those two elements. And infighting, there are a number of competing factions for his attention and for his agenda, and they are going to relentlessly work to undermine each other. So that factor will restrain him. The Supreme Court, I think, is very happy to have him as president. They will gladly take some more Trump picks to replace Alito, to replace Clarence Thomas, who I suspect will both retire within the next 2 years, which will give Trump, 5 of the nominees on the court, at least. But I don't think the Supreme Court wants him sticking around for good. Like, the Supreme Court isn't interested in turning over its power to him. And the same is true of the military. He is going to work extremely hard to stack the military with as many loyalists as possible. But I think it's an open question as to whether or not there even are enough of those types of people who exist in the world to fill the positions that would be needed to take real control of the operational control of the military.
That last thing he said was the most hopeful thing, because all fascist regimes depend on a good relationship with the military. And that's one thing that Trump has never been able to do for obvious reasons. The other reason I picked that is I'm upset at the Democratic Party for being what many people have called the party of small ideas. And one of the reasons that Trump won was that, as crazy as ideas are, they're big ideas. Mass deportation. He's not going to be able to do that, or at least, across the board tariffs. He's not going to be able to do any of these things. But he excites the populace by putting those things forward, which the Democrats do not do. And that's why you got to give Trump credit for being the salesman that he is.
I agree with you 100%. There's a tendency now for Democrats to hide their neoliberalism by running candidates who say, well, we don't want to make promises we can't keep. To me, promises reveal your soul. And it's okay not to keep promises, because you can always deflect the blame onto the Republicans. If you're a candidate for president, you should make promises. Promises reveal what you believe. Doesn't matter if you can't keep them.
Yeah, leave pragmatism and clear-headedness to city council. Like, be
bold. I mean, the whole reason
you're working, work harder, try harder, compete, try to compete for me.
It kind of ties back into what we were talking about with the ICC, was that there's a principle. You stand up for a principle and you may not get there, but at least you've tried. And it gets back to the whole reason we're here. I mean, my involvement with Ralph started with making this documentary called An Unreasonable Man, and is based on the George Bernard Shaw quote, "The reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable one adapts the world to himself, insists on adapting the world to himself. Therefore, all progress depends on the unreasonable man." And the Democrats refuse to be unreasonable.
They negotiate with themselves.
Yeah.
The thing that I think that I've found troubling, and I have a feeling a lot of people did, about the way the Democratic Party approached the most recent election is, and the last several elections and everything post everything, is the big tent approach to the Democratic Party. They refuse to incorporate what they consider to be these fringe ideas from the left. They think that people aren't going to walk. They think, well, you're talking a big game. You're trying to push the platform further to the left, but you don't really mean it when you say you're leaving me. You're really never going to leave. And the people in charge of the party and the face of the party in November, which was Kamala Harris, they don't really mean what they say. So they don't think we, the constituency, means what we say either. It's a game.
Yeah. And that's interesting.
You, Steve, you said that about Kamala early on, about her complete lack, like the way she approached her debate, post debate with Colbert, that she talked about it like, oh, it's just debating. It was just a debate.
Right.
And the hollowness, if they don't mean what they're saying and they're not promising something they care about, it's insulting. It means something to people. And when the candidates and the leadership don't see that, it's insulting. And
it also, the thing that crystallized in my mind this election cycle was that there are two parts to a candidate running. It's saying the right things, and then the second part is making people believe what you're saying. And Kamala Harris was, a lot of places said the right things. And I hear people telling me, well, but she said this, but she couldn't make anybody believe it.
What was the one promise she made? Can you name one promise she made that you could sum up in fewer than 3 words?
That's the problem. No. And that's why you probably will not see her on the national scene again, because there's no idea behind her. There's no movement behind her. Even in 2020, during the presidential primaries in the Democratic Party, you could pretty much identify with those 20 people on the stage, at least an idea behind them, whether it was Bernie with Medicare for All, Elizabeth Warren, tax the wealthy. My college classmate, Tom Steyer, was about climate change, along with Jay Inslee, the same thing. Even these fringe candidates, you could identify with an idea.
What was Biden's?
He didn't have one either.
Obama. Biden's platform was Barack Obama.
Yeah, and Buttigieg was, I'm young and gay and fresh. And Amy Klobuchar was, I can beat Republicans. Those are strategies, but they're not principles and ideas. And so she was a cipher. And we're all surprised that she didn't win when she didn't even make it to the Democratic primary 4 years before.
The Democrats are surprised she didn't win. I think the thing, going back to what David said, I would disagree with when you said they're saying the right things and doing the right things. She didn't even say the right thing. We all know that a politician is going to make promises they can't keep. That's politics, baby. We all know that. No one's naive enough to think that I will say until the day I die that an executive is an executive. The president of the United States, they're never going to allow a true populist to be president of the United States because it is an executive position. It is inherently anti-egalitarian in its core. And yes, Bernie seemed to come close. I won't get into why I think he was never going to win from a systemic perspective. But, politicians run on a platform. It's raised. They're campaigning on something that's elevated above the day-to-day material stuff. So we all know there's artifice. We all know there's a game to it. So to not even put in the work to play the game harder. You want me to vote for you? Try harder to trick me. Be better at manipulating me. My president, like, you can't even lie to my face as a candidate. How the heck are you going to be president and do the job of a president? Show me the respect of trying harder to trick me. And that, like, to me is so offensive about the Democrat. It's so lazy. The game,
Well, Hannah, our next couple of clips are going to speak to that too. Francesco DeSantis, who could not be with us today, picked a couple, and they're both about unions following the Democratic Party. Jimmy, why don't you read what Francesco said and then play the clips for us?
This first one is Mark Dimenstein, and Dimenstein's talking about labor unions taking an independent approach to politics rather than working hand in glove with the Democrats. And he talks about what is called a quote unquote dirty break with the Dems, third parties, and the creation of an independent labor party. Francesco says that he thought it would have been interesting to talk about this in light of the Teamsters/Sean O'Brien tactical alliance with Trump and its success, the nascent independent alliance in the British Parliament, and how organized labor can lead on this issue.
Mark Dimenstein, by the way, is the head of the Postal Workers Union. Roll it, Jimmy.
I think you've touched on a really important point. It's really important for the union movement to have and to function in an independent way when it comes to politics and electoral politics. And I think it's been a weakness. I raised this with the AFL-CIO leadership and the council, so it's not a secret. I think it's a weakness for the labor movement to be following the baton generally of the Democratic Party leadership. And I think that it takes away, well, number one, an awful lot of labor union members represent all different political views. So we do have to respect that. But more important than that, you mentioned going back a couple generations, the Democrats more were viewed as the party of the working people and the Republicans, the party of the wealthier. But really, both of these parties generally represent the corporate interest and the Wall Street interest. Now, it doesn't mean that on particular issues, the Democrats may not be better than the Republicans. And maybe on some issue, some of the Republicans may be better than the Democrats. And that underscores the need for independent politics. So, for instance, in our union, we passed a resolution at our national convention, I believe I think it was 2016, calling for an independent approach to politics and saying, yes, in elections, we do want to elect pro-union, pro-worker candidates. But in addition, we want to focus on, for instance, issue-based politics, referenda on whether it's on the environment, on voting rights, on living wages. And then we're bringing workers together on the issues wherever we stand on the political spectrum. And so I think you're on it. I think that we've weakened ourselves as a labor movement, hitching our stars to one political party, and in many cases, almost asking permission or following the baton of the Democratic Party leadership. So we're for independent politics. Our union's on record to explore the possibilities of third parties, of a labor party, as we still work to elect good pro-union, pro-worker candidates to office from dog catcher to president.
Okay, let's move on to another perspective on this that comes from Hamilton Nolan, who wrote a book called The Hammer. And again, Francesco, what does Francesco say about this, Jimmy?
Here he says that Nolan expounds on the same topic as Dimenstein, the need for a politically independent labor movement that can make a real demands of the Democratic Party. And if those are not forthcoming, can go build its own independent base of power, i.e. putting campaign cash into organizing instead. And he says, I particularly appreciate his nuanced view on Biden regarding labor and his prescription for alternative action.
Roll it.
Yeah, I mean, you're right in that for many, many years, organized labor's had a very unhealthy relationship with electoral politics, which is, you're in a two-party system and the party wants to destroy unions and crush them off the face of the earth. And the Democratic Party's attitude has basically been, we're the only game in town, and so give us money and we won't try to kill you, but we won't really do too much to help you either. And that's pretty much where labor has been in relationship to national politics for many decades. And as you point out, Obama didn't spend any political capital to help organize labor. He didn't get card checked. Bill Clinton was probably actively harmful to the interests of working people in America with what he did on free trade and neoliberalism. So you can go back even through Democratic presidents and see that for all of the billions of dollars that unions have invested in those presidents, they haven't gotten a lot back. So it's, the results of that strategy speak for themselves. You can look over the past 50 years of American history and see that that strategy has not paid off for organized labor, period. And yet it's very hard, I think, for the labor leaders to break out of that mind state. And you see it playing out in this election too, where it's like the AFL-CIO endorsed Joe Biden 18 months before the election. 18 months before the election, they endorsed the guy before Israel and Gaza had even started, and then they put themselves in the position of just being a surrogate to the Democratic candidate and not being able to push them. So, I think the solution has to be, you have to be willing to push the Democrats. The solution is not running into the arms of Republicans, because Republicans are worse by every single measure. But at the same time, you have to be able to withhold your support and force Democrats to come to you. That is one thing, at least, you saw the UAW doing a little bit, in the sense that, certain unions didn't come out and endorse Biden as early. They made him do things like, for example, go visit the UAW picket line, which is something. It's not as much as we need from Biden, but it's an example, at least, of a union saying, we're not going to be a rubber stamp for Democrats. We have to be able to kick Democrats in the ass and make them do things, tangible things for workers. Or else, another thing unions can do with their money is, instead of sending it to Joe Biden's campaign, use it to organize workers. The choice is not just between Democrats and Republicans. We can take those resources and use it to organize workers, which will increase our political power in its own right.
Yeah, one thing I appreciated about his comments on this is we tend to focus on kind of federal elections on the show, like federal government, the national stage. Occasionally we'll touch on the value of down ticket races. And I think there's a bit of myopia in how we talk about the movement, labor movement, involvement in politics as this national thing, when how much could you accomplish if you spend that focus and that money on state elections, local elections? And to me, Hamilton Nolan's comments on, well, it doesn't just have to be Democrats and Republicans. Something I see underneath that is, it doesn't have to be about the presidential election.
Right.
It doesn't always have to be about the biggest thing. What if we stop talking about these people who suck, and instead we spend our time on local elections, on, building local political capital, just shifting the focus? To me, the way he was framing it, I think, is so common sense, but also kind of more rare than I think it should be, that we have people going, it's this protection racket. It's, well, we're not going to kill you, so pay us and we won't kill you. Like, we're better than the alternative, which is the absolute worst possible outcome for you. And what if we just don't do that? Just like the Democratic Party negotiates with themselves in, these national elections, I think he's pointing out that unions are negotiating with themselves. They're coming in. It's like how IATSE never goes on strike. It's, no one's really going to take you seriously at the bargaining table if they know you're never going to walk away, because they're the only game in town. And I think that's such an important, again, common sense, but understated piece of this.
All right, very good. Now we're going to move on to a slightly different category, and it's justice, both criminal justice and actual educational justice. Let's start with, David, your clip from Jonathan Kozol, the great writer on education.
I picked this because I wasn't there for this episode, but he talks about apartheid in America, that if you look at our public schools, the racial divide is as pronounced today as it was before Brown v. Board of Education.
Well, the first question is, whatever happened to Brown versus Board of Education, which supposedly desegregated our schools starting in 1954?
Well, to be quite blunt, as I say in the book, the Brown decision is now like the ghost of Christmas past. Most school officials have pretty much turned their back on the legacy of Brown and the dream of Dr. King, who was very explicit in his condemnation of segregated schools. I find it particularly heartbreaking that segregation is now at its highest level since the early 1990s. And many of the schools I visit are far more deeply segregated than the one that I described in Death in Early Age, in which there were at least a handful of white children in the school. Worse, however, than mere physical isolation is what I call the disparate agenda that has been developed and enforced in primarily Black and Latino schools, in which, as you just quoted, the children are perceived as if they were defective little people who cannot learn in the normal ways that children do in good suburban schools. It's an agenda which is in part a matter of shaming the children. There's this constant fear, failure, instead of an invitation to learn for the joy of learning. It's what I call a coercive uniformity. All the children are to behave in a way that's mandated by rules that have been passed down over the past, say, approximately 25, 30 years. The book describes the ways in which children are denied the opportunity to learn out of curiosity, to ask discerning questions. The punitive agenda is sometimes draconian in its nature, but children who commit minor misbehaviors are sometimes sent to what are called the calm down room, which is a wonderful euphemism. What it is in reality is typically a storage closet in the hallway in which the child is left to sit there all alone, doors locked. Children will cry for their mothers. They wet their pants. This is considered acceptable in these deeply segregated schools, not all of them, but certainly many. I walked into a school right here in Boston's Black community, where I asked the people who were escorting me, what's that little closet used for? And they just calmly told me, that's the lockdown room. That's only the most minor form of punishment. A lot of the children are also subjected to corporal punishment, which is still permitted in more than half the states. A teenage girl, for example, in a Texas school, slipped out of the building briefly to get a breakfast taco, was told that she had just broken the closed campus rule, and brought to the principal's office, where two adults held her down, made her bend over with her buttocks raised so she could be beaten on her bottom. One other form of punishment is the frequency of juvenile arrest, of calling in the police to deal with a minor problem that could have been handled by a counselor if the school could afford a counselor. In one story I tell in the book, a little girl, 6 years old, who had a minor tantrum in her classroom, was brought into the principal's office, and somebody started reading a story to her and calming her down. But by that time, they had already called the police. Officer comes in, puts her in zip ties, literally drags her out of the building, pushes her into the back of the patrol car, and brings her to a juvenile center, a detention center, where they actually take a mugshot of this little girl. She's so small that she has to stand on a stool in order for the photographer to capture her face, her head and shoulders. Just extraordinary. And we hear a lot about the school to prison pipeline, but this is a case where the prison is already there. It's right there. They don't have to wait 20 years. Children get a taste of our racist penal system when they're barely out of diapers.
So, David, why did you pick that clip?
Because there's only so much you can shove into a human being's brain. We overemphasize knowledge, the role that knowledge plays in our schools, when it's really about socializing our children, teaching them that there's a bigger world outside their family, their city, and their country. And the only way you can deliver that important education is through integration. The idea that you send your kid off to school and they're with people who look exactly and sound exactly the way they do, it limits their education. It limits the education of kids in an inner city school, and it certainly limits the education of these schools in Greenwich, Connecticut, or Beverly Hills.
Anybody else have comment?
Yeah, I think one of the big myths, and this was part of Jonathan Kozol's broader interview, is I think we in 2024, 2025 like to think about things like segregation as de facto. And I think it was really eye-opening to look at the de jure segregation, the apartheid system, that it's not just, well, happenstance, things end up segregated. Yeah, we have to do all these kind of soft social adjustments to desegregate. What he brought up, I think, highlights an important point, which is a lot of systems are still racist, are still reinforcing segregation, still reinforcing apartheid, still enforcing separate, and still enforcing unequal. And if we go about solving problems rooted in race and class and access and how people are treated and all of these lived experiences that can be really harmful to young people and affect their opportunities and affect just not their future, but their present. If we focus on de facto conditions, the softer reasons things are the way they are, and we ignore the fact that a lot of it is laws, a lot of it is the system is officially set up this way. And if we want to change things and modify people's experiences and make it better and make it less segregated, you have to confront the system. You can't pretend that it's no longer legally segregated.
Well, which leads us into our next clip with somebody who spent more than half of his life incarcerated. We spoke to Mumia Abu-Jamal, who was what many people believe wrongly convicted of murder in the early 80s in Philadelphia. And we were able to speak to him about the two-tiered justice system. Roll that, Jimmy.
I hope this is not too obvious, but when you see and read about the trials of Donald Trump and see how the court and the legal system treats him, and in particular his plea for absolute immunity to commit crimes, a man who said he could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. What do you have to say about that, and how does that make you feel?
Steve, I love it when I hear or read of so-called conservatives talking about, two tiers of justice. If anything, there's at least three tiers. There's one tier for white people, another tier for black folks, and a third tier for the very rich. Now, guess who gets sweetest deals? I mean, look, it doesn't take a rocket scientist, right? If you're rich in this country, you can get every break that you can afford. You can get the best justice, the best lawyers, and they will fight wars.
I felt very privileged that we were able to speak to him. We actually had to record those in advance and have him record them separately, but it sounded like he was actually able to speak to us there. Jonathan Kozol talks about the school-to-prison pipeline. Mumia Abu-Jamal was highly educated. He was a journalist, and he ends up in this segregated, what we call criminal injustice. We're going to take a short break now and check in with our corporate crime reporter, Russell Mokhiber. When we come back, we're going to wrap up with a number of quick takes on some miscellaneous issues.
From the National Press Building in Washington, D.C., this is your Corporate Crime Reporter Morning Minute for Friday, January 3, 2025. I'm Russell Mokhiber. The British-Canadian computer scientist, often touted as the godfather of artificial intelligence, has shortened the odds of AI wiping out humanity over the next 3 decades, warning the pace of change in the technology is much faster than expected. That's according to a report in The Guardian. Professor Geoffrey Hinton, who this year was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics for his work in AI, said there was a 10 to 20% chance that AI would lead to human extinction within the next 3 decades. Previously, Hinton had said there was a 10% chance of the technology triggering a catastrophic outcome for humanity. Asked on BBC Radio 4's Today program if he had changed his analysis of a potential AI apocalypse And the 1 in 10 chance of it happening, he said, not really, 10 to 20%. For the Corporate Crime Reporter, I'm Russell Mokhiber.
Thank you, Russell. Welcome back to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour. I'm Steve Scrovan on our Staff Picks Day, here with David, Hannah, and Jimmy. No Ralph in person today, although you've heard his voice. We just heard that from Russell about AI. And Jimmy, you picked a recent conversation we had with AI expert Martin Rotenberg. Why don't you set that up for us?
All right. Yeah. So in this clip, Ralph and Mark, founder and president of Center for AI and Digital Policy, discussed the growing disconnect between experts in various fields of AI and the power structures of corporatism and government. And then Mark goes on to highlight the challenges experts face in understanding these systems and the implications for society, emphasizing the need for transparency and regulation to prevent negative outcomes.
This area is just producing a massively expanding gap between the experts from various disciplines and the power structure of corporatism and their government servants and the rest of the people in the world. Does that trouble you? And explain why, if it does trouble you.
Yeah, it does, Ralph. And I'm very glad, you gave that example. I mean, of course, I remember your work on auto regulation, but what was also interesting in that moment, was that people understood cars, they understood engines. It was not that complex to talk about, for example, the thickness of brake linings. That world has changed. This world has evolved very rapidly. And as I said, I got started in this world. I wrote these programs. And then I, went off, became a lawyer, came back and tried to understand these probabilistic learning models. And I just couldn't, But what was interesting to me is that the experts didn't really understand them either. And when you had the leading experts in this field, I don't know if you know some of these names, but Stuart Russell or Yoshua Bengio or Jeffrey Hinton, these are all considered to be sort of the people who've created these modern day techniques, saying we don't understand now how they operate. That's really a very interesting moment. It reminded me of Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility a number of years ago, warning about the use of computer systems in weaponry, precisely because the outcomes were so predictable. But I think, as you're suggesting also, because it's so difficult for most people to comprehend what's going on. And that's actually why I took a moment at the outset of your program to try to explain the difference. And it is important between the old-fashioned decision tree, rule-based expert systems that we could understand and interrogate and correct, and these modern probabilistic statistical systems where we really don't understand why certain results are being produced. We can't prove outcomes. And from a simple scientific perspective, we like to think that there's a way to establish why a recommendation has been presented and not simply rely on the fact that the machine is supposed to be expert. That's where we are in this moment. Opaque systems that the experts don't understand, increasingly being deployed by organizations that also don't understand these systems, and an industry that says, don't regulate us. This is not going to end well.
Jimmy, you have more to say about that?
Yeah, and the reason why I picked that is because I am fascinated with AI. I admit that I have used it in the past and I continue to use it to this day. But I also know, based on the information, not just from what he's talking about, but my own investigating, that yes, these systems, they are at a point now where they're just doing their own thing and we're not even at AGI yet. So it's kind of concerning because people, we know humans have the ability to be bad in many different reasons, or they'll take technologies and use it for bad things. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that back up to show people, because I think that it's important that people stay aware of what's going on.
And it's an issue, a consumer issue, in the sense that you have this principle of this technology that's moving so quickly, as Russell mentioned in his little report there. And do you let it do harm first and then say, oh, we need to put the guardrails up? Or do you try to put guardrails up before? And I think in this next administration, obviously, it's all about taking guardrails down for everything across the board in every industry. And unfortunately, I believe a lot of people are going to pay the price for that.
Yeah.
I think it brings up an important distinction, and we touched on it when we had Mark Rotenberg on, the difference between professors or scientists debating the society of artificial intelligence engineers or whatever, their debate at a convention about red lines in their research versus policy debates versus consumer protection lines. We're having these big picture discussions about what AI should be allowed to do. And there's a big difference between what AI should, like the limits on AI, full stop, versus the limits for what consumers should be exposed to. And I mean, I think I say this a lot. I think it's almost a red herring to have this big existential philosophical debate about AI when really we should just be talking about the consumer protections, right? Like, I'm a civilian. I don't need to weigh in on, I'm not affected by where AI research goes. I really just am affected by where it goes in terms of consumer tech. And that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me when he was in his interview. Good clip, Jimmy.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to wrap up here with one last clip. And this is Hannah. This is one of your picks. We had Vani Hari, who bills herself as the food babe, on, and she had organized a demonstration against Kellogg's because of the chemicals that they were putting on their Fruit Loops and other cereals. And that was right in Ralph's wheelhouse. So, Hannah, you picked this clip. This was a little exchange you had with Vani Hari. Why'd you pick this clip?
I'll preface this by saying this clip did not make the radio edit. This was a podcast cut. And I disagreed with a lot of what Vani Hari said. So this is not an endorsement. That's why I wanted to include it. It was a really interesting exchange for me as a person who each week asks a question of a guest, right? Like, I'm not a journalist, but I'm a person who gets to ask a question of someone when they come on to be interviewed. And she tried not to answer my question. And I just think from a media perspective, I just think it's a really interesting exchange. And I wanted to talk about it.
All right. I can't wait. Jimmy, roll that.
So my question is about deceptive marketing practices and unsafe ingredients in dietary supplements. Unlike drugs that have to be proven safe and effective for their intended use before marketing, there are no provisions in the law for the FDA to approve supplements for safety and effectiveness or their labeling before they reach the consumer. I agree with you that it's important to look for conflicts of interest, and considering you yourself run a supplement company, are you mobilizing your audience in support of stronger regulation and more robust consumer protections for dietary supplements, not just the foods that you've mentioned?
Yeah, so this is funny that you asked this question. You know, one of the reasons why I started Truvani was because of that reason. Because anytime I wanted to take a dietary supplement or a protein powder has been part of my repertoire for a really long time. I use it as fast food to make a quick smoothie with a bunch of fruits and vegetables, and I throw protein powder in and I call it a meal instead of going to McDonald's. And the protein powder that I was always purchasing had so many unnecessary ingredients and so many different synthetic vitamins and minerals and things that I just didn't want to consume on a daily basis. And that's why I started my company, Truvani, to create the gold standard in terms of ingredients when it came to supplements. And so we actually created our company like it would be regulated by the FDA, where we do third-party testing for everything under the sun you could imagine, like mold and heavy metals and glyphosate and other compounds and other things that you wouldn't even think that you would want to test for, because I wanted to create the healthiest imaginable product out there, but also with the least amount of ingredients. So when you look at our protein powder, for example, it's 5 ingredients. It's chia seed, pumpkin seed, and pea protein. And then you've got real vanilla in there. And it's just absolutely incredible because it's in a little bit of monk fruit as the sweetener. But
I don't mean to interrupt. I know we're short on time. My question is more about, you run a company in an industry that is left to kind of largely
regulate themselves. Yeah, no,
and
absolutely. So
and you you have a massive network and you mobilize campaigns. And so that's why my question is about, are you mobilizing in that industry?
I think what's really concerning to me is that we have American food companies poisoning us with ingredients that are in our American food supply that is being regulated, right? And when it comes to a supplement, that is like something that people take if they want to take, right? It's not like a thing that can be mandated by the USDA, which is right now in schools, the Fruit Loops is part of the USDA program, right? So it's a totally kind of different situation in terms of the impact. And so, but I think you're right. I think there does need to be regulation when it comes to dietary supplements. I think there needs to be third-party testing. I think there needs to be some kind of somebody looking after all of these supplements. I agree, because I don't, again, there's no companies like Truvani, I can tell you, not very many anyways.
So Hannah, something tells me you were not satisfied with that answer.
I was not. And I picked my own question, which I know is a bit self-congratulatory. But we talk a lot on the show about media falling short, not holding people to account. And one thing that I've learned working with you all, working with Ralph, hearing from these people each week is use your time to ask the questions. And when someone is in front of you claiming that they're all about questioning conflicts of interest and pushing corporations, holding corporations to account. And then they also have a company that is not regulated. And my question is just, do you want your own company to be regulated more strictly? And I don't hold this against her. She turned it into a hype sesh for her company. Going to talk up how well she does things. I'm not like other corporations, which I don't begrudge anyone promoting their business, but that wasn't my question. And just saying, my question was actually, are you using your platform? Are you using your influence to push for, like patriotic millionaires saying tax the rich? Are you, from a position of influence, encouraging people to change the system, I guess, to your disfavor, to your potential
disfavor? Yes.
Yeah. And she's not. The answer was no. And somewhere in there was no, I'm not. But there was a whole lot of other stuff. And I think like the reason it sprung to mind when we were picking our highlights is no, the answer was no, but that was like a 4-minute long plug, which again, want to promote your product, fine. But we're here to ask a question and get an answer. And I just.
In true Feldman prosecutorial tradition.
No, I would say grand jury. I'm a grand jury. I want to know if there's a case there to look into. I just, that wasn't I'll ask the question again. Please answer the question.
David?
Do you worry that you will lose access to that person if you ask difficult questions? Isn't the access more important than the answer?
I mean, I'm joking.
That's the media today.
I know. You started a bit and I'm answering it literally. It's uncomfortable. I will say, asking the question, there's a bit of a thrill. It's like you're being naughty. You're being a little bad. You're asking a question of a guest that might make them a little upset or uncomfortable, or send an email saying, how dare you, which didn't happen. I'm not saying that, but like asking those questions, there's a little bit of frisson when you do it, but there's also this dread. Like, what if I just do something congenial? What if I just ask a congenial question?
Right. So real journalism.
Are you calling me a real journalist?
I'm sorry?
You calling me a real journalist?
One of the things we think is journalism is CNN, the Sunday morning shows. Real journalism is reporting on a subject and then offering equal time to that subject. But interviewing Donald Trump and letting him filibuster is not journalism. That's not the best use of Meet the Press, although it is called Meet the Press, where you do interviews. But on CNN, interviewing a senator is not journalism. Reporting on what the senator is saying, what he's done, and why he's doing it, and then offering him a 3-minute response would be real journalism.
All right, very good. Now we're going to conclude today's year in review. Hannah, you have a couple of quick takes for some favorite quotations.
Yeah, these are, I think, going into 2025, my inspirational quotes or some aspirations that I'm going to take with me. So Rick Perlstein who writes about American conservatism. He wrote Nixonland. He was talking about fascism. And he said what fascism really means at base, and why I use this word not as an insult, but as a descriptor, et cetera, et cetera. I just think it's not an insult. It's a descriptor.
Just telling you what you are.
Yes. If you're insulted, so be it.
Yeah.
So there's that.
What else you got, Hannah?
So from Apartheid Education, Jonathan Kozol, he said, I always say I'm not going to be forced into a phony optimism to please my critics.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan Kozol's had enough. It's just what I got from that interview. He's had it with these.
I just think it's words to live by. I'm not going to be forced into phony optimism to please my critics.
Yes, that's excellent. What else?
From Captains of Conscience, Ken Bosong, who is a solar energy advocate, he said, what keeps me going? Basically, the bad guys.
Nice.
The haters keep me going. I'm fueled by the hatred of my enemies.
Nice.
This next one is from Throwdown for Peace, Hassan El-Tayeb from the Friends Committee on National Legislation. He said, if we care about peace, we have to throw down for peace.
Yeah.
Cool. And then the last one is from Norm Solomon from The Morning After. That's the show we recorded the day after the election. And he's talking about the Democrats. And he said, we can't afford to grade them on a curve.
Yeah. Which we've dealt with extensively on this very program. Well, Hannah, thank you for that. That's our show. We hope you enjoyed our staff picks, our year in review. I want to thank Hannah and David and Jimmy and Francesco in absentia, and of course, Ralph in absentia for being the whole reason we're here. For those of you listening on the radio, that's our show. For you podcast listeners, stay tuned for some bonus material we call the Wrap-Up, featuring Francesco DeSantis with, in case you haven't heard, a transcript of this program will appear on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour Substack site soon after the episode is posted.
Subscribe to us on our Ralph Nader Radio Hour YouTube channel. And for Ralph's weekly column, it's free. Go to nader.org. For more from Russell Mokhiber, go to corporatecrimereporter.com.
The American Museum of Tort Law has gone virtual. Go to tortmuseum.org to explore the exhibits, take a virtual tour, and learn about iconic tort cases from history.
To order your copy of The Capitol Hill Citizen, Democracy Dies in Broad Daylight, go to capitolhillcitizen.com.
And remember to continue the conversation after each show. Go to the comments section at ralphnaderradiohour.com and post a comment or question on this week's episode.
The producers of the Ralph Nader Radio Hour are Jimmy Lee Wirt, Hannah Feldman, and Matthew Marin. Our executive producer is Alan Minsky.
Our theme music, Stand Up, Rise Up, was written and performed by Kemp Harris. Our proofreader is Elizabeth Solomon.
Join us next week on the Ralph Nader Radio Hour.